Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my mid-year check-in. It is July, which means that June has entirely passed, which means it is firmly past the middle of the year. And so I have been taking some time in the middle of the year to sort of check in on my reading goals, see how I've been doing with all of those, really think about how I want to be reading and the ways that I want to be reading towards the end of the year in the second half of the year. So I thought I would do a little video just talking about my goals for the year, how I've been doing on those, my favorite books that I've read so far this year, my least favorite books I've read so far this year, who I'm reading from, and what I'm excited and looking forward to reading in the second half of the year. I also have a much better matcha latte for myself. I went out and bought milk, and then I also put strawberry jam in it and also vanilla cold foams. Yes, I love really sweet drinks, and this is a drink I saw in a cafe and it was really good, and if I do say so myself, mine is also good. It's a cute drink, so I'm gonna put it in frame. So I guess we'll just go through, and first of all, let's go through my goals that I wrote down at the beginning of the year in January, and we'll just talk about how I'm doing with those. So my goals were to read 100 books, read 10% nonfiction, read 10 classics, read at least one book in a genre outside my comfort zone per month, do the r/female gaze spring summer challenge and the fall winter challenge, also do fantasy bingo 2026, and then also make at least one YouTube video a month. And then I just had overall like holistic non-quantitative goals, like use the library, utilize my Kobo, find new authors, read outside my comfort zone in general, and just keep like an open mind and an open heart towards books. So I feel like I'm doing pretty good on these. I have read 100 books. I've read 192 books this year. I have every single month read over 10% nonfiction, which is great. It's usually been around 15 to 18%. So that's like 3 nonfiction books a month. And then I feel like I have been reading at least a book outside my comfort zone every month, whether that be a romance book, a historical fiction book, a nonfiction book that maybe I didn't think would be a topic I would enjoy. And then I'm almost done with the female gaze spring summer challenge and also fantasy bingo, and then I'm excited to be able to do the fall winter challenge when we get there. And then also now that the Ursula K. Le Guin prize for fiction for 2026 has been announced, I will definitely also read all those nominees and make a video about that as well. And I have made at least one YouTube video per month, so I feel like I'm doing really good on those goals. I have also been using the library a ton. We can talk about that later. I haven't been doing as good a job as using my Kobo. I think I just go through phases with it where I'll read a bunch on the Kobo and then read a bunch physically. So I do want to get more use out of the Kobo Plus, because I am subscribed to Kobo Plus, and so I pay like $8 a month, but I feel like I've only read like I download a bunch of stuff and then I don't read it. So I need to get better at actually reading the Kobo Plus books that I download. I guess now let's talk about the actual like check-in. So my favorite books that I've read so far this year, number one, none of the rest of these are ordered, but number one has got to be Works of Vermin by Hiron Ennes. I absolutely loved this book. It's just a book that is so up my alley personally. Like, this book was written for me. I don't normally say that because I have very specific niche tastes, but this book fit all of them. It's about toxic gays, toxic lesbians, these toxic friendships that really blur the line between romance and love, and about these really complicated people living in very complicated circumstances. It's about this very like Baroque, weird city in a giant tree stump with all of these weird giant insects floating around and magic perfume and all of this really inventive world building stuff that feels so grounded in reality because we are using it to talk about fascism and politics and revolution and art. I was a theater kid. I love art. I love performing arts. So I love when fantasy and sci-fi books really engage with performing arts and think about what they would look like in a fantastical or like dystopian sci-fi context. I really liked Dreaming Metal by Melissa Scott for the same reasons, that it dealt with what performing arts would look like in a futuristic world. And this book is so deeply about art and performing arts, but also so deeply about politics and the way that those things are intertwined and that how they affect each other. It was so interesting and so up my alley. There are 2 sort of narratives going on in this book at once, which I feel like normally, like when there's 2 very separate narratives in a book, like I can prefer one over the other or just get really bored waiting for them to connect. But in this book, that wasn't the case. I was just really interested both in the narrative between Guy and Dawn and sort of their efforts to eke out a life in like the lower half of the city, working like menial jobs as exterminators, and also the like the other narrative, which is like this high noble people, like almost Great Gatsby-esque drama between all of these like upper echelon like richies. I just really enjoyed both of them, and then seeing how they intersected and how those two plot lines connected in the end was so interesting. It was very, very unexpected. I think you could definitely guess it way earlier than I did, but I went into this book knowing absolutely nothing about it, and so when I started to put the pieces together finally, like, and realize, oh my god, like, it's stuff that you could really brush off earlier in the book if like you're not really keeping an eye out for every single detail. And I almost think you're gonna ruin your experience going into it if you're like going into it expecting like some sort of massive twist and you're like on the hunt for that, because that's not really what it is. And again, I really loved that dawning realization of just like, oh, this is how these two things are connected. That's so weird, and that's so interesting, and that adds such a layer to the story that I just did not see coming at all and really loved. Like, I was 80% of the way into this book and I was already nominating it for the Ursula K. Le Guin Prize for Fiction. That's how much I loved it, and that's how weird and up her alley I thought it was. And this did get nominated for the Ursula K. Le Guin Prize for Fiction. It is on the short list. I am really excited to see it there. I'm so curious to see if anything will top it for me, because this is just, it's not going to be for everybody, and I can definitely see a lot of people coming away from it thinking that it's, I don't know, heavy-handed, or like that I saw people say they couldn't relate to the characters, they couldn't emotionally connect to the characters, which I just don't understand, because I immediately loved them so much and what they were up to. Like, this felt like reading Perdido Street Station, but with characters that I was just immediately so drawn to and so connected to. I just loved the characters in this, and I loved the world that they were running around in and the things that they were doing. This is genuinely one of my favorite books I've read this year for sure, but maybe one of my favorite books I've ever read. And Hiron Ennis has really like joined the ranks of Vajra Chandrasekhara, where like they only have 2 books published, but I just really, really loved them both, and like the passion that I have for those books has made me consider them like a favorite author, even though they're not like, you know, Ursula K. Le Guin, where like they have a huge back catalog of books that I have read and really enjoyed. Like, it's just these 2. It's just Works of Ermin and Leech from Hiron Ennis, and I of course this one I just absolutely loved, and Leech I really liked as well. So I'm very excited to see whatever Hiron Ennis does in the future. I would love a sequel to this book. Like, it doesn't really need one, but I would still love a sequel to this book, just like seeing what everybody's up to like 10 years down the line, see if there's any possibility or hint of reconciliation between 2 characters. Like, I think there is, but it would take so long, and it would have to be like its own book, just these 2 characters like working out and like one of them apologizing to the other. But that's kind of what makes it juicy, right? Like, there's just a little bit left unresolved that like makes me, I don't want to say write fan fiction for it, because I don't think I could do as good a job as Hiron Ennis did, but makes me want to see where those elements would go really far down the line. But like, it still is such a satisfying, cohesive, standalone epic fantasy. It's what, like 500 pages? 403, not even 500 pages. And I feel like this was such a well done, cohesive fantasy standalone that really wonderfully built a world, built characters, built a plot with such little pages. If you liked Disco Elysium, if you liked Vajra Chandrasekhara, if you like Dishonored, if you like The Great Gatsby, if you like any of those things, I really, really recommend this book. It reminded me so much of a lot of those things, but not in a way that felt derivative and like a cheap copy of, but just rather like that I can see all these various inspirations, or it takes little things, or maybe even it didn't take anything and I'm just seeing similarities between them that, you know, weren't purposeful, but like it was so wholly unique and so wholly its own thing that I just couldn't help but really fall in love with this book. And I've yapped about it for long enough now, but it's my video and I can yap as long as I want to, and everyone go read the Works of Ermin. But this is one of those books where like I loved it so much that if you read it and you hate it, you're not allowed to tell me. If you read it and you don't like it, that's fine, you can have your own opinion, but you can't tell me, okay? You have to tell me that at least that you know, it wasn't for you, but that you see where I'm coming from. So that is The Works of Ermin by Hiron Ennis. By far favorite book I've read this year. Another book I really loved was North Sun by Ethan Rutherford. This is like Moby Dick meets The Terror. It's about this whaling expedition, and it's so much about like an environmentally like conscious take on a whaling expedition. It's really about like sort of wondering like, is this okay? Like these themes of the meek being oppressed and harmed by the powerful, the silent being hurt by people who have more power over them, just the stuff that happens on the ship and the ways in which that whaling expedition structure encourages abuse among the crew was really powerful and poignant to me. It's also written in this really interesting style. It's like these little chapters, 1, 2, 3, and it's just a writing style that could have felt so gimmicky and could have meant that I didn't really feel connected to any of the characters or what they were doing, but instead I just found really interesting and really like fit the story it was telling. I nominated this one for the Ursula K. Le Guin Award. It did not make it on the list. I think probably because it's just not speculative enough. It's it's shelved in like historical fiction, so I just don't think it was quite speculative enough for the list, but there is a small speculative element. I really liked this one as well. Now that I've read Moby Dick, I really do want to reread this one and see if I can see any more of those influences, but yeah, this was just such a little surprising, poignant, unique little book that I wish more people read because I really enjoyed it. It's a little sad and a little scary, but it has sort of a hopeful, uplifting ending, so I do recommend it to like a wide variety of people. I also really loved Tender by Sofia Samatar. This might be recency bias, but I don't care. I really loved this book. This is a short story collection by Sofia Samatar. This might be my favorite thing I've read from her. I really liked The Winged Histories, which is sort of like a take on like a fantasy epic war novel where we never really see any of the war on page. We just see like the impact it has had on these very different women's lives, and I really enjoyed that book, and I love Sofia Samatar's prose, but this was just so impressive as a short story collection. I feel like short stories are so hard for authors to do. Like they either end up writing like the first chapter to a much longer unfinished novel, or they write something that just isn't entirely satisfying, something that feels very unfinished. Sofia Samatar knows how to write a short story. There are so many different stories in here of varying lengths. Some of them are like, 1 or 2 pages, some of them are longer, maybe like 15 to 50 pages, and I just really loved all of them. They're so inventive and there's so much experimentation going on here, but it all has that Sofia Samatar prose and Sofia Samatar depth and like just nuance and exploration and imagination, and I just really loved reading all these. It so deeply is engaging with the title Tender, with both as a noun and as a verb, like the feeling tender towards someone, feeling love and affection towards someone, but also the act of tending to someone and taking care of someone in the various ways that can be good and bad. And so yeah, I just really loved this one. I really loved the longest story in here, Fallow, which is about a sort of colony of Anabaptists who went off into space and founded this little, space colony where they follow these very strict religious guidelines, and how a character living in that society sort of comes of age and starts to sort of question the things that she's been taught and the ways of living that she's been taught. It reminded me so much of Ursula Le Guin. I really loved it, and I really highly recommend this one, even if like you have read her high fantasy and you don't really like it. I feel like this, because a lot of it is like urban fantasy, is a little bit more, I don't know, appealing to a wider audience, but there are still a couple of those like secondary world, like more high fantasy things in here, so I do also recommend this one to like a large variety of people. I really loved it. Okay, this one is definitely recency bias, but the books that I put on this list, one of my favorite books that I've read this year, is Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman. This is like a medieval horror book about this strange little girl who can seemingly see angels and demons, and who enlists the help of this fallen, disgraced knight to escort her to Paris and see the Pope and warn him about like the demonic happenings that are going on during the Black Plague. And it was just such an interesting, creepy little book to me. Like I just really enjoyed the writing style and the prose and sort of the themes and the journey we were going on. It reminded me so much of The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which is a book I also love. It's just a book that is so deeply about this totally desolate, ruined world in which people are very cruel to each other in their, attempt to survival of the fittest. But it's a book that is deeply about love and forgiveness. It's despite how bad the world is, we still have to love each other and we still have to help each other out. Like there are so many instances of that in this book, and that really I think is the takeaway of the book, that love and forgiveness are possible even in the worst circumstances. And I just really loved that. It's easy to get me with a theme like that. I just really enjoyed it. I really thought that the relationship between the little girl and the man, no, I don't remember their names. Yes, I loved the book, sue me. But I thought that like platonic, almost father-daughter relationship between them was so impactful, and it just was so well developed over the course of the story. Like their banter was really good, and normally I feel like when a book is praised for like the quality of the banter between the characters, it's really hit or miss for me. But it was just, it felt very realistic, like dialogue that really would be between like an older man and like a young girl, or a girl, you know, just sort of entering into puberty, and just the way that which she poked at him and he sort of took it, like I found it very charming and very well done. And then again, the sort of overarching themes I really liked. The, again, creepiness and the sort of medieval horror aspect I felt like was really well done. It had these very interesting set pieces set in like, you know, this religious horror element, which again is also a thing I really like. So I really enjoyed Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman. We'll see how well that holds up to the end of the year, because I really liked it, but it is a book that I read fairly recently, so we'll see if it like sticks in my head, like Works of Vermin and North Sun did. I also, again, read a fair amount of classics and nonfiction so far. My favorite nonfiction that I've read so far this year is this, again, might be recency bias, but I really, really loved There Is No Place for Us by Brian Goldstone, which is a book about the working homeless in Atlanta, about people who have full-time jobs, at times multiple jobs, and they still can't afford rent in a major city for them and their family. And in many cases, these people had homes, and then something totally out of the ordinary happened, like one of their houses burned down, and then while the house was like a burned out wreck, their landlord served them an eviction notice, like to the burnt front door of the house that they were not living in. And so because of the way the court system works, when they didn't show up in court for this eviction summons that they had no idea existed, they were technically evicted, and having an eviction on your record makes it incredibly difficult to get housing anywhere. So it was just that small thing that like totally didn't need to happen. Their landlord didn't need to do that, like totally ruined their lives, and just spiraled and spiraled and spiraled and made things worse and worse and worse. And so many of the stories in the book were like that. We follow like 5 families in Atlanta and their journeys to sort of gaining and losing housing over the course of several years, especially like during the pandemic. Like the pandemic hits in the middle of this book, and seeing the ways in which that just exacerbated an already really terrible failing system was really hard to read, and not actually surprising, but also just like very informative and a very worthwhile read. I really recommend this book to anyone that like wants to learn more about the state of housing and housing assistance in America. I found it just such a worthwhile read, and a read that I will recommend to literally anyone. I also really enjoyed Whipping Girl by Julia Serrano. This is a book from the woman who like invented the phrase transmisogyny, the word transmisogyny, and that as a concept. And I just found this to be like such a fundamental text of like trans theory, trans female theory mostly, like talking about her experiences and her view of the trans community, but also just in general. Like it just had so many good ideas and points, and so many foundational terms that she came up with and that she developed as an academic framework, and just the depth of it and the breadth of it was like staggering and just really, really good. It's a very long book, but so worthwhile and so interesting, and it just made so many good points and made me think so deeply about this. And it's one that I would recommend both to people who are like just starting to learn about the transgender community and trans people and like are looking to learn more, but also people who like are like know a lot and just like maybe want this specific person's experiences, or like the specific experience of like being an older trans woman, and seeing how terminology and how the landscape has shifted over like the 40 years that she's been out. Like it was just so interesting and so worthwhile, so I really do recommend that one as well. And then I also really loved My Autobiography of Carson McCullers by Jen Chaplin. This is mostly a memoir, but also shares a lot of information about Carson McCullers' life, and it's just a really interesting look at like what a biography can be. It's really like, can you ever get to the real person that you are studying, and does that matter if you can't, and the lengths at which we feel we have to go to in order to prove that like a historical figure was queer, especially with women. Like they are just assumed to be sexless and assumed to have no desires of their own unless like explicitly proven otherwise, whereas with men, like it's quite easy to be like, well, like maybe there's something going on here, but with women you have to like have it from the horse's mouth that they said they were a lesbian before you can even begin to theorize that that was the case. So this was just also so interesting. Even if you have never heard of Carson McCullers and are not like interested in her, or have never heard of Jen Chaplin and are not interested in her, like it's still such an interesting read about, you know, the way in which history remembers queer female novelists, and the ways in which that we can personally relate to famous figures that we see ourselves in. And then for classics, I really loved Moby Dick. I really did. It was such a surprise to me because I thought I wasn't gonna like it, and I thought it was gonna be so long and hard to read, but it was actually such a quick read. like the prose was actually so readable, and I found it really accessible prose, and just like even with all the tangents that Ishmael went off on, such a fun read. And Ishmael's like so funny in like a very understated way, and there's a lot of like really interesting stuff going on here where again, like Ishmael will go off onto like long tangents, but then also sometimes the book will go into like a play format, and just like the ways in which it played with narrative and played with Ishmael recalling his own narrative was so interesting, and I think very worthwhile. The fact that this book is dedicated to Nathaniel Hawthorne also is really intriguing to me. But overall, just a great book on, again, like, I'll steal Toni Morrison's wording for it, the metaphysical, philosophical inconsistencies that Herman Melville saw in the world around him, and his attempt to grapple with those things and make sense of those contradictions in the world around him. And yeah, it just was such a total surprise to me, but one that I really enjoyed nonetheless. And then, to speak of Toni Morrison, I also really loved basically all the books I've read from Toni Morrison so far, which is most of her books, but I think my favorite has to be Song of Solomon or Paradise. I really loved Paradise because it's the story of like these 8 women who live on like the outskirts of this all-black town, and just the ways in which the communities interact with each other, and the exploration of both that community and their community, and like it was just so wonderful. And it was interesting to me to go and see that it was one of like her lowest rated books on Storygraph, because it was so up my alley, and I really loved it, and it's one that I really want to reread from her. And then also I really love Song of Solomon, which felt a lot like Bluest Eye, but like longer and more thoroughly explored and developed. And again, also it has that aspect of like art and history, familial history, and just so much of Toni Morrison's work is about like misogynoir and the ways in which society treats specifically Black women, and like estranged family dynamics, these really complicated toxic family dynamics, and the ways in which that women are often like picked as the scapegoat to like blame all these problems on. Just so interesting. I really love a lot of her work. Her prose is just amazing. Like it's her and Cormac McCarthy for me, like 2 of the greatest like stylistic authors in the English language. Like I just love both of their prose. And a good segue to speak of Cormac McCarthy. Another one of my favorite classics was Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. Just such an interesting book. Again, his prose is so amazing. Such an interesting look at westward expansion and the sort of inherent violence of the colonizers moving westward, and the ways in which they interacted with the indigenous people and the Mexicans. So really enjoyed that one, and just like how weird of a coming of age story it was. The kid is just this figure that like weaves in and out of the book like a ghost or like a flicker of light. Like it's just so interesting. Again, I really want to read this one. Could read so much criticism about it, like theory about it, and still never really understand what exactly Cormac McCarthy was trying to do here probably, but just really enjoyed it. Okay, my least favorite books this year. Hell's Heart by Alexis Hall was one of my most disappointing reads, because I read Moby Dick so I could read Hell's Heart. I was really excited to read lesbian Moby Dick in space. I only read Moby Dick because I wanted to have that foundation in which to know what lesbian Moby Dick in space was doing. And so weirdly, I ended up loving Moby Dick and really hating Hell's Heart. And I kind of can't say that it's a bad book, but it's just so not for me, and it's so not what I enjoy in a book. It has a really present, self-aware, talking to the audience, chatty millennial humor narrator, which is just never gonna be my thing. It reminded me a lot of it's like The Lost Tomb, but if Gideon was like 10 times more annoying and like talking directly to the audience, and it just didn't work for me. It didn't click for me, and that's such a shame, because I did think that a lot of the things that this book was doing were interesting. The idea of like these hyper-capitalist space churches were so interesting, but the ways in which it was developed and delivered to us by the narrator was just such a miss for me that it definitely like ruined the book for me, and I was so disappointed because I really wanted to like it and I thought I was gonna love it. But anyways, a book that I didn't really necessarily have high expectations for, but that I really didn't like anyways, was Blood Canticle by Anne Rice. This was probably my least favorite book in the Vampire Chronicles series, and it was so disappointing because it came directly after a book that I didn't have very high hopes for. In fact, I thought I was gonna hate, and ended up actually really enjoying. It comes right after Blackwood Farm, which really like is a very weird book in the Vampire Chronicles series. It's very much an outlier. It's kind of a stealth Mayfair Witches crossover, but it's also about a completely different character who's unrelated to them either. It's about this guy, Quinn Blackwood, and he's been living in the woods in like this swamp with his family, the Blackwoods on Blackwood Farm, and he has like this poltergeist called Goblin that has been like with him his entire life, and a big part of the story is like learning about Goblin and how Goblin works and if Goblin is a threat to the people he loves or not. And it was actually really interesting. I actually really enjoyed Quinn as a main character. He's just so different from Lestat. He's very quiet and kind of like a soft, sensitive boy, and he is canonically bisexual, which was very fun. And I actually thought the romance between him and Mona Mayfair was actually quite sweet. They kind of matched each other's freak. They were just a couple of teenagers who like had really weird lives and were able to connect over the fact that they had such weird lives. So I actually really enjoyed that. And then Blood Canticle is kind of a direct sequel to Blackwood Farms and deals with a lot of the same characters, but instead of actually being a real sequel and focusing on Quinn and how he responds to the events of at the end of the last book, which are honestly like a cliffhanger, and the second book starts off like right where that book ended off, it swaps back to Lestat's point of view and is just kind of another Lestat story, and is like a weird love story between him and Rowan Mayfair that just comes out of nowhere, and it's just such a weird romance because you don't understand what they see in each other. Like, she fully has like a husband who she loves from her books, and then Lestat obviously has like many love interests in Vampire Chronicles already, and so it was a very weird romance. And you know, like, even the author doesn't really know how to explain why these characters like each other when every single side character has to ask them like, why are you guys in love? And they never have an answer. Like, it's just because the author wants them to be in love and thinks it's fun and like likes these two characters and wants them to make out. And I really didn't like that romance. And then I also again really didn't like that Mona and Quinn got so sidelined in what should have been their book, and instead they were just totally ignored in favor of that like romantic plotline and in favor of like wrapping up all the stuff from the Mayfair Witches series. I've never read Mayfair Witches. I don't really feel the interest to, so I just had no idea what was going on in those sections and no really interest in like seeing all that stuff resolved. So I just really didn't like this one. It was such a shame because I really did like Blackwood Farm. And then they're like all Quinn and Mona and like all the Blackwoods are like sort of unceremoniously killed off page in the next couple of books in the series. Like, she really low-key just forgot they existed, and then by the time she remembered they existed, it was too late. They'd already gone an entire book without being mentioned, so it kind of made like the only way it would make sense for that to happen is if they were like killed in like the catastrophe that was happening. So that made me sad, but like at least they didn't have to suffer through any more of the books. So that was definitely the worst book in the Vampire Chronicles for me. Very disappointing. And then a book that was also disappointing because I picked it up thinking it was going to be so up my alley was The Red Sacrament by Sarah Hinckley. Just, this promised to be like the Interview with the Vampire but with more of a focus on the political situation in France at the time, and instead it's literally like Interview with the Vampire fan fiction, the second half of that book from Armand's point of view. It was just so similar to Interview with the Vampire, and the main character was so similar specifically to Armand and like his backstory that you get in the Vampire Armand, that it like crossed a line for me personally. I know everybody's kind of gonna have a different line as to where they are like, this is not just inspiration, this is borderline plagiarism, and this book personally crossed that line just because of the amount of details and the amount of exact plot beats and backstory details that were taken totally unchanged or slightly barely changed from the Interview with the Vampire and the Vampire Armand. Like, it crossed a line for me. And then to go and see, you know, the author on Twitter tweeting about how anyone who is like reviewing her arc badly is just doing it because they're like jealous and they don't get her book, and like, you know, of course it's not Armand because, you know, no one could ever be Armand. Like, it's just corny, and it's just like, come on, just sit there and be like, yeah, it's heavily inspired by Interview with the Vampire. Don't be like, oh, it could never be. Like, it's so clearly Interview with the Vampire. And even putting that like plagiarism-y thing aside, I just also didn't like the book. I just didn't like the writing style. I thought the character relationships were really poorly done and poorly developed. The plot really dragged, and it wasn't actually political for a book that markets itself on being like the Vampire Chronicles but political. It actually totally ignores a lot of the politics going on in the situation at the time and just info dumps them all at the very end. And the unique elements of the book all come in at the very end after kind of the main plot is already over. So it was just a really weird reading experience for me. I really didn't like it. It took me forever to read, and I'm normally a very fast reader, but this book took me like 2 weeks to read for like a, you know, 200-300 page book. I did not enjoy it at all. And then my other least favorite book that I have read so far this year is Graceless Heart by Isabel Ibanez. This book, I kind of should have known going into it. It's just way more romantic-y than I was anticipating. It was, the flap on the front sounded so interesting about this like Renaissance-inspired, magical gem-inspired like magic system, and this girl who like wins this competition and then is like taken by these rich noble Italian noble people and like made to work for them, and it turns out they're actually like fae in disguise, magical creatures in disguise or whatever. And there's this plotline with like an evil pope who is like trying to, you know, kidnap the magic and take it for himself to use for nefarious purposes, and that all should be so interesting, but unfortunately so little of the story is actually about those things, and it's way more, all that stuff is kind of just an excuse to get the two main characters together so that they can have this romance, and I just didn't really like that romance. I found it to be really, again, rushed and fast-paced, and it just goes so quickly from like, this guy literally kidnapped me and I am not interested in him, to I would die for him, and in fact if I have to live without him I will kill myself. Like, it went so quickly, and this really just felt like the poor man's version of Luisa and Santangelo from The Familiar by Libero Duca, which I didn't even love that book either, but like, it's really, again, really similar. Graceless Heart is taking a lot of inspiration from that book without being honest about it, and the couple dynamic in Graceless Heart is very similar to that dynamic, where it's like, you know, a young woman coming into her power, a man who is older than he appears to be, sort of teaching her how to use it, and them like supposed to be enemies, but they end up like on the same side, and it's very much that dynamic of like, you know, trying to help each other in like the Renaissance period, when they have this like forbidden magic and forbidden attraction. But again, it just so did not work for me in this book because it was just signposted too much. Like, you could tell they were just getting together because the author wanted them to get together, and not because they had this relationship built up organically in the text. Like, he's calling her good girl from like page 30, and that gave me the ick, and I couldn't deal with it. So those are all my favorites and least favorite books that I read this year. Let's talk about stats. My average rating so far this year is 3.65. That's pretty low. I mean, that's almost a 4. We take those. I, again, have read 192 books so far this year and 66,203 pages. My top genres are fantasy, LGBT+, sci-fi, and romance, surprisingly. That's really interesting. I've read 89 fantasy books, 56 LGBT, 38 sci-fi, and 24 romance. Most of my books I get from the library. 133 of those 192 books I've read have been from the library, and then 32 books I've read I've had digitally. 14 of those books have been on my Kobo, the rest of them have been on my phone, and 25 books of the books I've read this year are books that I have physically owned. I've read 84% books in print and 16% digitally, 85% fiction and 15% nonfiction, so we're doing really good on that. And then my top authors I think is really interesting because this also kind of leads into the next question of like what I'm looking for in the next half of the year. My top authors read, number one, always in my heart, Ursula K. Le Guin with 9 books read, and then after that is Max Gladstone, because I did read the entire like craft sequence series so far this year, and I wouldn't really call it like a favorite of mine, but I do really like that series and find it very interesting. So I read 7 books from Max Gladstone, and then I have read 6 books from Toni Morrison, again, Queen, 5 books from Melissa Scott, who remains like a favorite author of mine, 5 books from Anne Rice, who I finished the Vampire Chronicles finally, and then 4 books from Samuel R. Delany, which will be a 5th when I finish reading Dahlgren, and I'm also really enjoying his stuff, and then 3 books from Katie Edwards because I read that trilogy that he has, and then 3 books from Kate Elliott, who I'm also actually really looking forward to reading more stuff from her. I really enjoyed The Witch Roads and The Keeper 6, and I'm really looking forward to next year in 2027. She has a release coming out called The Flower Court, which is going to be set in the same world as The Witch Roads, but it's going to be like a sapphic political fantasy set in like the imperial court, so I'm really looking forward to that. I will see if I can snag an arc of that one. And then I also read 3 books from Garth Nix because I reread the Old Kingdom trilogy, which was one of my childhood favorites, and I still really loved it. 3 books from T. Kingfisher because again, she just keeps publishing books and I keep reading them, even though I don't really like them that much. 2 books from Hiron Enes, who again has quickly become one of my new favorite authors, despite the fact that they only have 2 books out. So in the second half of the year, I am gonna be looking for any more books from these authors, although, a lot of them are not really active or dead, or very slow publishers. I'll be looking for that. And in the second half of the year, I really want to be, I have a couple books that I want to make sure I read from my like stack of owned books, and that in general is like a priority, just making sure that I'm still reading the books that I own, especially because there's definitely going to be a library book sale in the second half of the year, and I'm definitely going to buy a lot of books from that. So I would like to keep reading those, but especially I would like to finally read The Book of Love by Kelly Link. Kelly Link is a small beer press warrior. Like, she was published by Small Beer Press before, I think getting picked up by Random House when she was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. And then I also want to finally read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. I've had this, like, I really loved Piranesi when I read it, and so I've had this on like my list of books to read forever, and just the size of it has always intimidated me, especially the fact that it's set in like a time period and a time period in a setting that I don't typically love. It's 1800s England, which is not typically my favorite setting to be in, but I trust Susanna Clarke, and I got this really, I definitely prefer the design of the British cover. So I got this nice chunky little mass market paperback, trade paperback from Blackwell's. And then I also, low-key, I'm not committing to this hard, but I did used a copy of the Odyssey translated by Emily Wilson, and like, if I'm gonna read the Odyssey, it's gonna be her translation. There has definitely been just so much, like, people have pulled back up the discourse around her because of Christopher Nolan's adaptation of the Odyssey that's coming out, and so I would really love to read this one and finally read the Odyssey, especially a translation like this that I think I would really enjoy. Rereading plans. I have to do my yearly Bar of Cormorant reread at some point. Probably also my yearly Nine Fox Gambit reread at some point. It's funny because I feel like I've read the first book in this series as like twice as many times as I've read the other books. Not like because I don't like the other books, just because something about that first one is so fun and so easy to read for me. And then I would like to reread Book of the New Sun, because I got those paperback editions, so that I can read the second one. I would like to do that. And yeah, I'm also definitely going to be reading the books on the Ursula K. Le Guin Prize for Fiction 2026 shortlist, and making a video about that, so that's going to be really fun. And that's pretty much all I have for the second half of the year. There's a lot of the stuff that I was looking forward to being published this year was the first half of the year, and it's also hard for me to remember because I do have access to ARCs with the librarian email, which is like a life hack. If you have a librarian email, they like to give you those ARCs no matter how big your social media following is. So I get a lot of them early, and then I read them early, so then I forget, like, oh, that's coming out technically the second half of the year. So yeah, so I feel like I've had a pretty great reading year so far. I found a couple of really great authors. I just know the Le Guin shortlist is going to give me a couple other winners, and my cat's being cute. And yeah, let me know if you guys have read any of the books I talked about in this video, if you have anything you're really excited about that you've read in the first half of the year, if you have anything you're really looking forward to in the second half of the year. And thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!